Hello and welcome to the Beauty of Human Biology. I am your host, Tricia Reid. We're going to be exploring the language of the chakras and understanding that felt experience of being a human. I look forward to our journey together. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Newberg. Dr. Newberg is a neuroscientist who studies the relationship between brain function and various mental states. He is a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, a field known as neurotheology. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices and attitudes. Hi, Dr. Andrew Newberg. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you for joining us. So I invited you here because I know you do a lot of research on the brain and what happens in the brain. I know nothing, and I just speculate the magic that's happening. And so in particular, I wanted to focus on symbols and mudras and mantras and all of these things that some people believe are helping them in a different, higher state. So please share with us your research and your interest in why this is important for you.
Well, I think it's I think it's important globally because so many people are engaged in these kinds of practices like meditation, yoga, prayer, and I think trying to understand them as best as possible is always important. And so part of that, part of what that understanding means is that we need to understand how they affect people, and that can be qualitatively, subjectively, what exactly the person is feeling. On the other hand, we also need to understand how they affect us biologically, and that has implications in terms of observing how they have an impact on our mind, our body, our health, and well-being. And so those are all a variety of different aspects that we need to look into. Now, in terms of what's going on, well, it gets very complex. A lot of when you start to think about any aspects related to spiritual practices, there are so many different elements involved. So there are emotions, there's cognitive processes, there can be, as you mentioned, mudras, where they're maybe moving their fingers. There could be visual, auditory, and so it's not a surprise then that that when you actually get down to it, many different parts of the brain become involved in these kinds of practices, and that's exactly what we've seen in our studies. So obviously, as we go through, I'm happy to get into the more details depending on which ones you would like to specifically look at. But it really is amazing. I mean, there isn't just one part of the brain that turns on when we do or say something spiritual or feel something spiritual. It seems to involve many different parts of the brain. In fact, I argue that if there's a spiritual part of us, it's really our entire brain. And of course, if our brain is intimately connected with our body, then it's all of us in the end. So that's really what the data seems to be showing us. But it is amazing to look at all the similarities and differences depending on what a person is actually thinking or feeling.
Okay. So what's coming to mind for me first is if there is somebody that's raised in one country and they've been taught different rituals and that evokes something in them spiritually, is it possible, considering that that person's emotional attachment to those rituals might be different than, say, me or anyone else, over in a completely different country, trying to learn these things to perhaps have the benefits, even though in my mind, everything is its own language, right? So we understand math, that's its own language. We understand the brain, that's its own language. So as we go through these conversations, the chakras, it's its own language. So I'm trying to simplify it and just see, is it important? Is it tangible, the difference we're going to see by doing these things if I'm trying to learn something that someone else has already been living?
Right. Well, you're touching on a lot of very interesting issues, and I'll throw out a term early on to just kind of sort of circumscribe the topic, so to speak, which is neurotheology, and that's really where we are looking at the relationship between our brain and these practices and experiences that people have. And as I said, you bring up a lot of very interesting issues that we have to think about. So, for example, how much does one need to buy into, so to speak, the thing that one is doing in order for it to have that effect? And so when we look at yoga, for example, I mean, of course, yoga has a tradition that goes back several thousand years and has a tremendous spiritual basis behind it. In the United States today, for the most part, and a lot of countries around the world, if you go to your yoga class, it's very secularized. Oftentimes the spirituality is taken out of it, in either a little bit or a lot of it is taken out of it. And all of that's okay. What the data seems to show is that all of these practices, and doing them, even to a little extent, has an impact on us. But what some of our research has shown in particular is that the more one engages it, the more it's a part of your ideas and your beliefs, the more it becomes, a part of your life, then the greater the impact that it has in the brain. So when we scan a person's brain and they're just saying a prayer, or they're just doing a basic meditation, it works. It's doing something. But when they're really actively engaged in it, then we see a whole slew of other changes start to occur, and the brain becomes far more active or less active. All the different patterns that start to occur become much, much stronger. And again, we see this in several other examples as well, where the more a person is engaged, the more they know it, the more it becomes part of them, the more it has an impact on the brain. And similarly, if you say, well, I'm going to start meditation tomorrow, well, what your brain does day one of a meditation program is completely different than what it does on day 30, day 100, day 10,000.
What are you guys seeing when you're watching that?
Well, yeah. So, what we see is that there are long-term effects of doing these practices. We've been involved in doing some of the first longitudinal studies where, even over a relatively short period of time, we studied a practice called Kirtan Kriya meditation, where people repeat certain phrases and then they do the mudras where they touch their fingers. And we took people who had never really done these practices before, taught them how to do it. It was very secularized in that context. And then they did the practice. It was a 12-minute a day practice for 8 weeks. And then we scanned their brain again. And we scanned them both while they were meditating as well as just at rest. And what we found is that while their brain becomes active at rest, becomes active while they're doing the practice, there were actually distinctions in their brain, even just at rest, between the before and after doing this practice for 12 minutes a day for 2 months. So you can imagine what's going on in the brain of somebody like a nun who might be doing a meditative prayer practice for 50 years, hours a day. Mm-hmm. Now, the areas that we tend to find that are involved in these, again, there's many different areas of the brain, but some of the highlights, if you will, mm-hmm. Are that the frontal lobes, which are located right behind the forehead, when a person is purposely concentrating on a given practice, then they tend to activate their frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are involved whenever we concentrate or focus our attention on anything. So if we're concentrating on our breath, if we're concentrating on a mantra, on an image, then our frontal lobes turn on and we begin to allow our brains and our minds to concentrate on that particular thing.
Even if somebody doesn't believe in the effects of what they're doing, is there a tonal value? Is it like the focusing? Is it the tongue placement on the roof of the mouth? Is it anything like that? Or is it purely just going through the ritual?
Well, there are, as you mentioned, there are these different elements that are part of it. So when it comes to, for example, the frontal lobes and just concentration, what we have found is that the more you concentrate, then the greater the effect of the brain. Now we did a very small, N of one, as they say, one person study where I asked a good friend and a colleague of mine who considers himself to be an atheist, but likes to do a lot of meditation, to meditate on the concept of God, and his frontal lobes didn't really do very much. So part of it is, what you believe in and what's consistent with who you are and how you think, that allows you to, more actively engage. And if you're sort of in conflict with what you're doing, then your frontal lobes are not going to be able to turn on the way that they would like. Now, what's also interesting is that eventually, if you do these practices long enough, then we see another thing happening in the frontal lobes where they actually begin to quiet down, especially during peak states. And some have argued that during flow states and our research in terms of certain spiritual and mystical states shows that the frontal lobe actually kind of starts to quiet down. And when it shuts down, you're kind of giving yourself over, you're surrendering to that experience. And so that is part of that experience as well. And we see these kind of dynamic changes in the brain, which is very exciting to see. But going back to the Kirtan Kriya study just for a second, so we see the frontal lobes turning on when they're concentrating, because this is a very specifically prescribed concentrative practice. But even when they were at rest, their frontal lobes were more active at rest after doing 8 weeks of the practice compared to where they were before. And this is consistent with other studies that have been done that have looked at long-term meditators, where they actually find that the frontal lobes are actually bigger, they're thicker in people who are long-term meditators compared to non-meditators. And I think the analogy, which is well taken, that I always think about is that our brain does operate a little bit like a muscle. And so if you lift weights, what happens? Your muscle becomes thicker, and it physically it also becomes stronger. It can lift more stuff. So the brain is sort of like that too. It looks like it actually becomes thicker if we do a practice that keeps utilizing it in a certain way. And it becomes better at doing that. So in our study, we showed that people were able to concentrate more effectively and improve their memory. Again, just doing this practice for 12 minutes a day for about 8 weeks, they improved their brain function and their memory by about 10 to 15%. So, there's a lot of implications for that as you start to think about how that may have an impact on anybody's brain if they are trying to do that as part of their lifestyle, maybe as a way of helping an older person maintain their cognitive powers, or a younger person wanting to be able to, do better to study for a test or whatever it is that they're doing. So, so there do seem to be these very, short-term as well as long-term effects. And one of another interesting study that we did recently, maybe in the last year or so, was where we sent people through a spiritual retreat program. And instead of looking at just like the activity in their brain, we looked at a specific neurotransmitter, dopamine, and also again found that after just a 1-week program where very immersive, doing a lot of meditation, prayer, walking in silence kind of thing, that they also had significant differences in how their brain handled dopamine. And the differences basically reflected that the person was more receptive to spiritual experiences and more receptive to the release of dopamine, which is one of the feel-good molecules in the brain, that we were able to show, this kind of an effect again over, a 1-week period. So you can imagine what would happen for monks and nuns who are doing these kinds of practices for, years and years on end.
So can we talk about that flow state and that higher level of, okay, explain the flow state. So this is something I've been taking courses in, but I know that you've done a lot of research in that, so I'm not even going to try and explain it. But my question is this: when I've been in what seems to me to be a flow state, when I'm learning, I go into this state of euphoria, and it's incredible, that feeling. And so my question is, in that state of euphoria of learning and being in that flow state, what is happening in the brain?
So, you mentioned a couple of different things that occur for you when you're in that flow state. And so one of them is the sense of flow. And that does seem to be something that's associated with the frontal lobes. It seems that it's associated with a decrease, what they call hypofrontality, in the frontal lobes. And I think that makes sense. It's the frontal lobes kind of help to control things and control your attention and keep you focused on individual things. Whereas when you're in a flow state, it's like it's coming at you and it's coming through you. And so your own kind of willful consciousness isn't at play as much. And so we see those frontal lobes actually decrease. Now, interestingly, the frontal lobes regulate the dopamine systems of the brain and the emotional centers of the brain. So when the frontal lobes start to quiet down, those emotional centers start to, it's this kind of seesaw balance. And that's why, it can work in your favor or against your favor. So if the frontal lobes, if you become overly emotional, like when you become angry in an argument, what do? We speak without thinking. Why? Because our frontal lobes get shut down. And so we're not able to respond in a sort of normal cognitive kind of way. On the other hand, when our frontal lobes are turned on, then we can kind of settle our emotional responses down. But when it happens in a flow state, it can have a positive impact by allowing those positive emotions to take hold, and then have that feeling of euphoria or joy, or whatever kind of emotional response a person has. And once again, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we tend to see. We see during these states that the limbic system, some of the main emotional centers of the brain, and people may be familiar with, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, these actually turn on. Now, interestingly, as with many things in the brain, each area does a lot of different things. And so the amygdala, people often think about the amygdala as being involved in fear and anger, which it is, but it also tends to be involved in positive emotions as well. It's anything that's motivationally important, actually. So if a lion walks into the room, or if your child walks into the room, your amygdala turns on to tell you that something important is happening. In the case of the lion, you got to get the heck out of the room. And in the case of the child, you feel that sense of love and compassion for them.
Is there a difference in the intensity based on the urgency? You know what I mean? Like a lion versus a child, or is it still going to light up the brain, or is it just person to person? It's going to light up differently because the emotional attachment to their own story with that child or lion,
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and it's a little bit of both. So, obviously it depends on the magnitude of the stimulus. And certainly, if a lion walks into your room, you're going to start to get pretty panicked pretty fast, and your brain is designed for survival. So it's going to get very active very quickly and get you ready for the famed fight or flight response. On the other hand, if your loved one walks into the room and you knew they were in the house and so forth, then you may not have as much of a strong reaction. On the other hand, we all see these wonderful videos of people returning from Afghanistan or wherever, and they haven't seen their child in 8 months, and of course the reaction is priceless, and it's huge. And so there are a number of factors, and then as you said, there are personal factors. Each person may, some people are able to handle fear better, and some people are more crazy in love with some people than others, and so forth. So you just don't know exactly what are all those elements. But in the research, we do try to look at these different pieces and see what correlates with what. And there's in terms of the overall understanding of our brain, we've learned a lot in the last 20 years, but we've just really scratched the surface. There's so much to learn. And because of the amazing diversity of human beings and all the different ways in which we can react, it is very difficult, especially because, this is where science has a big challenge, because we like to have everybody do the same thing. In science, I mean, it makes it easy for us to say everybody's going to feel the same way, the same magnitude, they're going to have the same brain effect, and then we're going to compare that to another state where they're also all going to be all the same, and then we can see the differences. And if we have 20 people who all do the same exact thing the same exact way, we'll be able to see it, and statistics works nicely that way. But the downside is that we're all individuals, and so trying to learn about the inter-individual differences in many ways can be just as important, if not more important, than looking at the larger group. I mean, my favorite example is thinking about like studying music, for example. One way to do that is to take 100 people and have them all think about music or listen to music or whatever, and see how their brains do that. And that'd be great. You'd learn something about how people generally process music. The other approach would be to get Mozart in the room and have Mozart listen to music and see what Mozart does. And then now you've got somebody who's so far off the scale that you'd clearly learn a lot about what's going on from a musical perspective, but you don't know whether you can apply that information to the larger population or not. And the same is true of spirituality and science and all these different aspects of humanity. So there's always those people who are at the extreme level of these things, and trying to understand them is fantastic and important, but you also have to understand how everybody else is too.
So what led you to want to study this, and how can we understand a little bit more about that higher level of spirituality that comes in the seventh chakra conversation, and what have you found? I know that's a lot all wrapped in one.
That's okay. Well, I mean, for me, a lot of this, and a lot of why I got into studying the brain at all goes back to really childhood, when I was curious to know, why people had different religions and different political parties and beliefs, and of course, even more so true today. How can we all be looking at the same world and have completely different perspectives of what's going on? So my initial thought was, well, let's start with the brain. That's what's processing all this information and helping us to formulate our opinions. But as I went through and looked at that, and especially as I went through my education and started to look at different philosophical approaches and spiritual approaches, and studied traditions such as Buddhism and Hinduism, as well as the Judeo-Christian Western traditions, I realized that it gets a lot more complicated than that. And so in my own mind, I realized that there was a lot to be said for trying to find some kind of integrated interdisciplinary approach, hybrid approach, that brings together the best of what we can learn from a scientific perspective with what we can learn from the spiritual perspective. And then I had a very good fortune of, when I was in medical school, being able to connect with one mentor who was my mentor in all of the imaging world, and we did all kinds of brain scan studies of Alzheimer's and depression and all that kind of stuff. And then another mentor who was equally wonderful, and also interested in the brain, and specifically about how we think about things religiously and spiritually. And then eventually, my little light bulb went off, and I said, well, wait a minute, if we're using brain scans to study Alzheimer's and depression, why can't we use it to study spirituality and meditation and things like that? And so that was really what kind of launched all of that about 25 years ago, in this whole field of neurotheology, which was just developing and continues to, I hope, evolve and develop into its own field in its own right. But there are a lot of fabulous questions, and part of maybe the last part of the answer to your question is that that the field of neurotheology really looks at these questions from the very esoteric to the very practical. So we can ask a question about how does meditation reduce depression, something very practical and very clinical. We could ask a question about, well, if somebody's deep in meditation and it alters their consciousness, what is consciousness and how does that relate to the brain? And then we can get into, well, how do we think about these spiritual concepts? How do we think about what a chakra is? We understand what a chakra is from the perspective of the yogic tradition and what it says that they are. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean in terms of how we start to integrate that into what's going on in the body? So if we experience our heart chakra, is there a way to look at the heart and see, is it really in the heart? Or is it not? And I mean, the brain's amazing. When you stub your toe, it's really hurting up here, but it feels like it's hurting down there. Yeah. So, when you feel your heart chakra, is it really in your heart and you're feeling, the heart in the heart itself, or is it something that you're feeling in your brain, or some combination of all of that? And of course, there's, even one additional step, which is, are we all just biological, or can we consider the possibility that there's something more? Is there some energy, consciousness, whatever people want to talk about, that is actually, something that takes us beyond just the pure biology of our brain? And again, certainly in mystical experiences and a lot of these intense spiritual states, that's exactly what people describe, that they get beyond their brain, they get beyond their consciousness, and they look at the world in a whole different way. And in spite of all of that, they perceive it to be incredibly real as an experience. So from my particular perspective, and looking at it from this neurotheology vantage point, we have to take all of those perspectives very seriously, and we need to be open to them, and we need to explore them and ask a lot of good questions and do some studies and get more, and generate more questions and then keep going.
Yeah.
So
this is my favorite part. This is the whole phrase, know thyself, means something different to me every day, because the more I read or the more I interview, just learning about how simply we're just having common experiences, but we all interpret them very differently because of the language that we have. The expression of I feel joy when, that's going to mean something different to you. And so to think of I feel peace when, because I meditate, well, what if it doesn't do that for someone else? What if they have a different attachment to it? So when you were talking about Parkinson's and dementia, it made me wonder, have you been able to watch the brain for somebody who has Parkinson's or dementia when they are going into a spiritual ritual? Is there anything special or unique that happens in that?
So I personally have not done that research, although there is some interesting related research when it comes to that piece of the neurotheological puzzle. When I think about neurotheology and trying to understand spirituality in the brain, there are many pieces to that puzzle. And so, looking at meditation, yoga, so, those practices is one. You bring up another one, which is really interesting, which is the idea that that there may be, that if we look at how the brain deteriorates, so to speak, how does that have an impact on our spirituality? So, for example, there have been a couple of studies that have been done. There was a study that was done looking at Parkinson's and found, Parkinson's affects the dopamine system. We were talking about that earlier with our spiritual retreat study. And what it found was that when people have Parkinson's on one side of the body versus the other, it tends to result in lower descriptions of their sense of religiosity and spirituality. So there's something to the impact of Parkinson's on a person's sense of spirituality. Similarly, and this is also very interesting, there have been some studies looking at people who have various injuries to the brain, particularly like cancers and stuff like that, like a tumor in a certain area of the brain. And what they found was that another area, which we haven't mentioned yet, the parietal lobe, which is located in the back of the brain, when a person has an injury to that part of the brain, they are more likely to express feelings of self-transcendence. Now, that was a wonderful finding from my perspective, because we had argued and continue to argue over the years that that the parietal lobe is an important player when it comes to spiritual experiences, because the parietal lobe normally takes our sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self. So when we get up out of our chair and we walk out of the room, it's the parietal lobe that helps us to kind of maneuver ourselves and aim us through the middle of the doorway, and so it helps us to see ourselves and see how ourself interacts with the world. So when the parietal lobe turns on, we have our sense of self and how we relate to the world. Theoretically, then, as the parietal lobe quiets down, we should lose that sense of self, and we should lose the boundaries between ourselves and the world. And that's exactly what we've seen in practices of meditation and prayer. When people feel that sense of oneness with God, sense of oneness with the universe, they have a decrease of activity in the parietal lobe, and it's associated with those common experiences that are described, that sense of oneness, connectedness, a sense of unity, depending on how people describe it, which are really fundamental to these kinds of enlightenment or mystical types of experiences.
Have you guys been able to quantify that connectivity that people may be feeling by using more, opportunities on computers of going and watching their church services or their spiritual, content and being together in a group? Are you able to measure if people are still feeling that connection as intensely to their peers?
Again, we haven't done, I don't think anybody's done that specific kind of research yet. The sense of connectedness is an interesting one, because, the piece that you're bringing up, which is also, quite an interesting issue, is, the group rituals versus individual rituals. And so, or group practices versus individual practices. For anyone who's done both, they know that there's value in both of them. When you're with a group, that you can get this sense of resonance and connection with the group itself. But you can also be by yourself and feel a deep sense of connectedness with all of humanity, or with God or whatever. So it seems like it can happen no matter what. It depends a little bit on what the brain's sort of attitude is and perspective is. As I always have argued, you could be a group of 5 or 6 people, and if in your prayer practice or your meditation practice, you have a sense of oneness with all humanity, then your group is connected with all of humanity. If you have a sense of connectedness with the group, but not all of humanity, then this is where sometimes these practices can turn problematic. And then, your group becomes the group, and the group that understands the world or knows what's right and knows what's wrong. And then everyone else, they're not part of the group, and they're not part of your reality. And so, that can lead to very problematic ideas about people, because then you start thinking, well, my group is right, your group is wrong. Maybe and if you keep telling me that your group is right, well, maybe there's something wrong with you, or maybe you're evil. Maybe we should get rid of you. So, you can see how these kinds of rituals can become very negative at times. And again, this is, to me, another big area for neurotheology to understand, which is what happens when practices go wrong. And you've mentioned the chakras and Kundalini, and of course, for those who are well versed in understanding Kundalini, certainly far more than me, Kundalini is wonderful when it goes well, but it can often go awry. And I don't say often, but it certainly can go awry.
Okay.
Well, and people can have very negative experiences. They can become anxious, depressed, scared. They can feel very badly. It can make their body feel problematic and bad. So, one of the questions that we have is, well, what's happening? What's the difference between the person's brain where the experience goes well versus the person's brain where the experience goes badly?
Makes me feel like they need to have a guide through that. And a lot of what you just said made me think that in other situations, people need to have guides. And so I wanted to ask you about breathing practices in place of people using, psychedelics. Okay, so what's coming to mind for me is I want to ask about, and maybe you haven't looked into this, but I'm guessing you have. So I'm aware of Stan Grof's work where he explored holotropic breathing. And so it makes me want to ask you, what's the brain experiencing? So that's the first point. But then also the group mentality, in some situations can be a mob mentality when things go wrong. That's the other thing that's coming to mind. But it's also very important in getting in a group flow state. And when you were talking about whether someone's doing their practice on their own, alone, or with a group, the importance there of knowing that energy. And does that help facilitate that spiritual height connection? Is it heightening that connection? What's happening there? I think they all come together in one. So that's why here we are.
Well, if I understand your question, I mean, the issue of the negative side, to just sort of finish up on that conversation, is, it is quite fascinating of a problem. Arguably speaking, when you do have a group of people who are kind of acting as a mob, as we've sort of seen over the last 6 months or whatever, there really is a very big group mentality, and in many ways there is that sense of connectedness, and so my colleague and late mentor Jean DeQuilly and I used to talk about how rituals are a morally neutral technology. They can be used for great good or great evil, and so people can rev up a group of people to go out and help the whole world, and they can rev up a group of people to go out and destroy the whole world. And in both circumstances, the people feel deeply connected to whatever it is that they're doing. So again, the question becomes, how do we distinguish between those positive and negative emotional aspects? And is somebody feeling joy as they are killing another person? I mean, you get into some really weird questions here,
Right.
In terms of where the distinctions are. And that's something that I do hope that neurotheology can help us to understand. As far as the first part of your question about breathing techniques and so forth, there has been very few studies which have actually compared techniques to each other. What the data seems to show, at least from my vantage point, is that every technique seems to have an effect, and many of the techniques have very positive effects. And it can be something as simple as doing a basic breathing exercise to someone who is focusing on an image or an object like a candle. It could be a mantra-based practice where they're repeating certain phrases or sounds over and over again. It could be yoga poses that they're doing. So they all have an effect, and many of them have very positive effects. They tend to reduce anxiety and depression. They help to relax people. They help people's brains to, sort of be more active and be able to concentrate and focus more deeply on things. And all of that seems to be true. What we don't really know is, are there certain ones that work best in certain circumstances or for certain people? We don't have that data. And I kind of have lamented this to others where I say, look, if you come in with an ear infection, I know what antibiotic to give you because I know what is the likely organism and I know what are the antibiotics that help to treat that organism. But if if I have one person come in and it's a 20-year-old college student who's stressed out about finals, or I have a 55-year-old divorcee who's stressed out about her family situation, or I have an 80-year-old who is worried about Alzheimer's, I don't know if they all should do yoga, or if one should do yoga and the other should do Kirtan Kriya and the other one should do mindfulness, so we don't really have that knowledge and that information yet. And again, that's another area where I hope that over time we'll get more, comparisons, if you will. I guess, the good news is that they all have value and they all have benefit for the right person in the right context. But the trick is always trying to match that up. And that's part of why there are thousands of different practices. And, and again, as someone, when I put my physician's cap on and somebody says, well, which meditation program should I do? It's a challenge. It's hard to know exactly what the best thing is to say to somebody because, there is no one size fits all.
That's my favorite part, is exploring all of it and piecing it together. But even day by day, it's just going to be different because day by day, our whole person's changing. So
and that's a perfect point too, which is that, even for any given individual, it might be valuable to have different options to go to. They might need one thing when they're just really stressed from work. They might need something else when they want to get themselves energized. If they develop a migraine, they might want to do something different, so it just depends.
But even something as simple as what you had just mentioned, just staring at a candle, for goodness sake, just stare at a candle, even if, nothing else, stare at a leaf, anything, just stare at one little thing. I love
there are lots of ways of doing it. And that, that is an important point too, which is that people often think, oh, well, I can't meditate. I don't have an hour a day to do that. And the data show that focusing on a candle or focusing on your breath, even for a minute, is better than doing nothing at all. And it's a little bit like exercise. It's great to be able to spend a half hour a day doing some nice exercise, but at the very least, walk up the 3 flights of stairs to your office and walk down the flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. So every little piece of effort and work does help.
Yeah, it's fun. Through COVID, I've been working with Brian Bradley and his team over with Egoscue. I don't know if you know them, but they have me on this routine, and one of them is staring at the wall, and my toes are pigeon-toed, and I'm literally staring at the wall, and I've made it one of my meditations, and I'm doing that because you're almost standing in Tadasana, and so everything's just open, but you have to stand there pigeon-toed and activating, and it's very presencing, like centering. It's amazing where we can find that in our whole day.
Right. Well, and another thing that's important is for people to think about what that is. This is something I encourage people to to spend some time thinking about, which is, what are your goals of whatever practice that you want to do? Is it stress management? Is it something religious? Is it something spiritual? Because again, what you decide to do could be very different. If you just want to relax and de-stress at the end of the day, that could be very different than saying, I'm really interested in trying to get to some type of spiritual enlightenment. And of course, there's the whole gamut of ideas in between. So knowing what your goals are becomes important as well.
Well, I think this is an invitation to dig in a little bit further, and we'll get you back on one of these really soon, because I feel like
sounds good.
So much we did not cover, and so much. So thank you for your time, Andrew. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Newberg, I should say. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's a lot of fun, and I'll be happy to come back we can start getting into the depths of the brain or the
Yes.
depths of mysticism,
Yes.
or both.
All the above. Thank you.